It's also a much bigger challenge in the theater. If you don't like the way a light is performing, you climb up on a ladder, you move it over 2 feet, you change the gel, you change the focus, you change the dimmer, and you get what you want. In architectural lighting, once it's in the concrete, that's over. You're done. So you have to be much more precise and, in a way, much more knowledgeable about what you're doing because you mostly don't get a second chance.
David, it seems to me as if you had come to a potential fork in the road. You could
Absolutely.
have at that point gone off and done exhibit design or some other kind of design, and yet you returned to lighting. So what was it that exerted its attraction for you?
I didn't think you could be a jack of all trades. I was not really an exhibit designer. I was not a lighting designer. I was sort of a special effects
We're going
guy.
to move.
Didn't seem like that was going to be a business, just intuitively. I felt that I knew about lighting, and that since everything that I had been doing involved some aspect of lighting, that I would rather try to be good at one thing than be pretty good at a bunch of stuff. And so I decided to open my own lighting design firm. Well, there's a preface to that. That's when I went to visit with various lighting consultants who were in business at the time. And that's when I concluded that there were some who were talented but didn't know how to run a business. There were some who were doing business but weren't very talented. And there were some shady practices going on that I didn't think were appropriate. And I said to myself, why can't you be a good lighting designer and run it like a business?
Talk a little bit more about how design changed over time and some of the things that you liked and maybe didn't like from the point of view of technology and lighting practice.
There are certain hierarchies in most department stores. Certain corners of every aisle, intersections are going to be lighted. The second row of tea stands or whatever are going to be lighted. There's a way of predicting, not 100%. And we would put in 12 or 15% more monopoints than we had accent lights, with the idea that as the merchandise moved, the lighting would move with it. Now, that was wholly dependent on the interest and desire of the display people or the store manager to actually utilize that. Flexibility is a double-edged sword. It's wonderful if you use it and it's provided. If you don't use it, it's very expensive. You have a lot of options sitting there not being used. We were lucky in that we had a client who let us put on an education program, a training program, and so forth. So we probably got more utilization out of it than maybe with another client. But it did allow you to have every light be in a meaningful position, not a position that somebody decided on paper before there was ever merchandise in the store. To me, good design, good in quotation marks, is design, lighting design, is design that fulfills the need of the user, fits in well in the environment, and is easily maintainable so that it retains the original design characteristics through the life of the installation. If something is difficult to be maintained, it will not be maintained. And if it is not maintained, then what you designed is meaningless. It's something else. It's whatever somebody can screw into an outlet. And if I may digress for just a moment, when someone says, that's a great lighting, that's a terrible lighting job, I don't think you can say that unless you know what went into it. Because you can look at what appears to be a terrible lighting job, and it can be a brilliant solution to an otherwise unsolvable problem. And unless you know what's above the ceiling, unless you know how much power was available, unless you know what the budget was, unless you know the time frame, you can't judge any kind of a lighting installation because it may be, as I said, a brilliant solution to an otherwise unsolvable problem. In lighting design, since you can't, other than a mock-up when it's already partially built or an existing building, you can't show somebody a building that's only on paper. And you can't show them something else and say it's going to be like this, only brighter, smaller, bluer. They can't make the connection. And so when you're selling an idea, a lighting idea, you're doing it with words, with emotion, with gestures. And you have to convince your client that you know what you're doing and that what you're doing is what they want, and make them understand, and you can't show them anything. And once you've said something, you can't take it back. And I taught that in my office for years. Anything you say, anything you don't say, you can say tomorrow. But anything you say today is never going to go away.
Talking about lighting is in some respects like talking about music. You can't see it and you can't hear it, yet we still need to be able to communicate it. How do you do that? How do you do that?
Adjectives. When I would stand before a client for a building that didn't exist, I found that I would use adjectives to create a feeling, impart a feeling, a concept, and rely on the words and the emotion behind the words. When I was in the theater, I had a friend who was an actor, and he used to say, it's hard to fake sincerity. And so you have to, I think, really believe in the idea that you're trying to communicate and feel it yourself. If you're not convinced yourself that it's a good idea and it's the way to do something, you can never convince anybody else to do it. You really can't. A presentation that starts out as, I'm not sure that this will work, but we ought to forget it. They stop listening after the introduction. So we use things, and these are not my words in particular, sparkle, soft, glowing, sharp, a white wall that jumps out at you, create the feeling of space, create a feeling of intimacy. Those kinds of words are evocative and will help people get the sense of what you're trying to do. Now, that is a way of doing it. The best way still is to believe in what you're saying and get the other person to believe in what you're saying. Also in 1968, that was a good year. We were retained to do the relighting of the public spaces in the Breakers Hotel in Palm Beach. The Breakers had been built again in the 20s by the Flaglers for the New York 400, people in the Blue Book, and it was literally open 6 weeks a year, something like that, for the season. And it was closed the rest of the time. Well, after World War II, that wasn't going to work anymore. They built some meeting rooms and things. They started opening up the teachers' conventions and whatever, and found out there's a lot of people who want to go to Florida on convention in the summer. And they decided to upgrade the lighting in the main lobby and in the main dining room and some ancillary dining rooms and some loges along the side. Outside, there is I don't exactly know what you call it. I can't think of the word. It's a long colonnade, if you will, an enclosed area with columns. And there was an outlet in every bay, but nothing there. And when we went inside and looked at the side loges to the main dining room, there were these lanterns, which were clearly exterior lanterns. So I took all of those lanterns and put them outside in this loggia, I guess, or colonnade, if you will, where it's clear to me that's where they belong. And then there was one big chandelier in the main dining room. It had clear lamps, and it was blindingly bright because it had to light this enormous dining room. There were two of them. So we came up with the idea of creating 6 new chandeliers at the end, the half, and okay. We took castings of the parts from the main chandeliers and made 6 smaller chandeliers, matching elements and so forth. We put shades on everything and put them on dimmers. And now the room is uniformly lighted, softly lighted. And everything goes together. Then there is a circular dining room, which had sconces mounted, 12, 14 feet up on this wall that made no sense. But the wall that they were mounted on was blue glass mirror. not a good, old, not a good chance to move the fixtures. So we designed a replacement sconce with a very large escutcheon plate. The outlet box was up at the top, but put a very large escutcheon plate, lowering the whole device, and then big sweeping arms that came down and went back up again. So we visually lowered the sconces without actually ever moving the outlet box. Put shades and crystals and things on them, and so forth. I mean, I won't go through every room. The compliment was, at the end of the job, I had occasion to talk to the manager of the hotel, and he gave me the best compliment I've ever gotten on a lighting job. He said that people who had been coming there for 30 years came back for the winter and walked in and said, "The place looks wonderful. What did you do?" They couldn't tell what was new and what was old and what had been changed. And I thought that was the best compliment I ever got. As a lighting designer, your personal experiences are with lighting are part of your continuing education. Everywhere I go, not consciously, but I see things and say, "Gee, that's nice. Gee, that's not so nice. I wonder why they did that. I wouldn't have thought of that." I believe then, and I do now, that the ceiling in a retail space should be visually quiet unless you're selling ceiling tiles. If you're not selling ceiling, the eye we know is attracted to the brightest object. I think the brightest object should be something that's for sale, not something on the ceiling. I think you have to go into a project with an absolutely blank mind, a blank sheet of paper, and understand what the project is, what the function of the space will be. That's, I think, paramount. What the architect or designer wants it to feel like, and they don't always go together, and that becomes difficult. And then say, how do I achieve with lighting these two tasks? How do I make it work, and how do I make it look or feel the way the designer or the client wants it to be? Going in with a preconception, you're taking all your options off the table. That's exactly what I think we're not supposed to do. Any one time where somebody came in and said, "Wow," or
Yeah, kind of that would qualify as a particularly noteworthy piece of lighting equipment.
Sure, but not necessarily in the context of a specific project. When fiber optics got to be a big item, and you realize you could put things in hazardous locations and not have to worry about water or explosions or whatever, you say to yourself, "Wow, next time I do a fountain or whatever, that's something I want to try or I want to look at." LEDs for sure,
Mm-hmm.
for sure. MR16s in context really solved a problem, and I think that's terrific when that's the problem. When it isn't your problem, they don't make any sense. But sure. So there are a number of things that have. I find when people used to come to us with control systems, new ideas for control systems out of context make my eyes glaze over. They don't mean anything to me. When I have a problem and I want to control it a certain way, and I say, "Dan, can you come in? Do you have a system?" "Yeah, we can do that." That's terrific. But to come in and say, "We have this new control system and it's got this many presets and that many controllers and we can do all these things." Well, if I don't need to do those that day, nice to know about it, but until I have an application, it's not meaningful. It's too technical and too much stuff. Not meaningful.
Your perspective, greatest lighting project in the world. Could include yours. Doesn't have to be yours. But if so to speak, you had one destination to recommend for somebody to go to see it, what would you say? I'm going to be on Earth for one day. What lighting should I go visit and see?
Well, that's relatively easy. The Taj Mahal, but not the interior, the exterior. And you have to go there at dawn, and you have to go there at sunset. And it's done by the best lighting designer there ever was.
The architect.
No, God.
God had help.
No, no.
Doesn't the sighting have something to do with it?
Oh, perhaps, yeah, yeah. I actually just saw that last year, and whatever you've heard about it, however people have raved about it, they understate it. It is worth a long trip to get there. Inside, there's nothing. It's really not much to see, and even getting up close to the building is not. It's not extraordinary, but the sighting, the symmetry, the romance of the architecture, and the way it changes color from dawn to dusk is beyond. It's without description. I mean, it's beyond description. I have to say that the Hagia Sophia in Istanbul is quite remarkable. It's an enormous chamber, and it's lighted by chandeliers that are hung maybe, relatively low, 12 or 15 feet off the floor, but the ceiling is a gazillion feet high. They're very large hoops with just little candle lights on them, and it is haunting, and it's haunting in a different way than a great cathedral. The cathedrals were designed deliberately to disappear up into the darkness and be mysterious and so forth. This is not like that. It's actually, I think, a dome. And it's not as vertical. But the lighting is very evocative, very haunting, and it makes you want to talk softly and stand quietly.
The Hagia Sophia is today, of course, a mosque. It was designed as a Greek Orthodox church.
I saw it as a mosque.
Saw it as a mosque. Yeah. Would you describe the recent ASHRAE 90.1 documents that prescribe lighting power limitations as positive or negative developments for lighting?
I want to remain a citizen, so I don't now, certainly, and never did really get all caught up in codes and that sort of thing. I think clearly that there is an art to lighting, and I don't think you can legislate against art, nor do I think you should. We were talking about, or you were going to talk about, using lighting, for example, for purely aesthetic reasons on a bridge, not for circulation or vehicular traffic, but just to enhance the bridge. And how do you respond to people who say, well, we're in a crisis and we can't afford the electricity, we can't afford the energy, what shall we do? And my answer to that is there is a quality of life. There is something about life that is worth living and worth experiencing, and it should have its niceties. We could all go around in gray tunics, and we could all drive black Fords, I suppose, and be the equivalent of Stepford wives. That's certainly not what life is about in this country. That's a little bit what life was like under communist China, and it didn't last, and it never does. People do want to experience life. They want to enjoy themselves. They want to feel fulfilled. They want to feel emotionally stimulated, and sometimes you have to pay for that. Probably all the time you have to pay for that. But it's almost always worth it, because it wouldn't be much of a life without it. My experience is that the single best training ground for lighting is theater, stage lighting. I'm prejudiced because that's where I come from. But so did Howard, and so did Paul Morantz, and so did Abe Fader. A number of pretty experienced people started in the theater. The reason I say that is lighting is very much a plastic medium. And in the theater, you get to try something, and if you don't like it, you can unbolt it and move it over 2 feet. You can change the angle. You can change the intensity. You can change the sharpness of the beam spread. You can change the color. And you can do that with 250 instruments on a stage until you get each one doing what you want it to do, until you compose the picture you want to compose. And that flexibility and that experience of saying, you know, I'm going to try this a different color pink, not blue, but I'm going to go from this pink to a little more pink or a little less pink, um, lets you build up, I think, a mental inventory of lighting experiences, which, in my mind, I call on whenever I was designing lighting. When I look at a lighting plan and or look at an architectural plan and I know what the materials are going to be and so forth, I would see a full color slide in my head of what I thought it was going to look like. The degree to which the final job looked like that slide was when it was a successful job. Um, so you need to build up. That's why I said to you before, when I go out and look at a restaurant or eat or walk down the street, I'm still adding to the database of lighting experiences. You get to have that experience in the theater because it's easy to correct a mistake. It's easy to change your mind, never mind a mistake. You cannot do that in architectural lighting. I don't believe that you can learn lighting design sitting at a desk. I don't think you can learn it on a computer. I don't think you can learn it by taking courses. You can learn principles. But the way to learn lighting design is to experience it. And for that, you have to, if you go to work in an architectural lighting design office, you lay out a job, you need to go out to see what the job is, how it came out. How does it look compared to what you imagined? If you can't build up that reservoir of experiences, then you're shooting blind. You don't know where you are.
Looking at that time span and thinking about the way you encountered the luminous environment when you began and what you see today, what would you identify as the most significant changes over that 40 to 50 year period in the way spaces are lighted?
Energy, concern about energy. It was a big concern in the early 70s, the first oil crisis, but it was fleeting, and we all forgot it pretty soon. Now I think that people understand it is a real problem, not so much because of the shortage, but because of what it costs. And I think people are pretty well convinced it's not going to get cheaper. So the concern is how to utilize energy in an efficient way, and if you're a designer, in an artistic way. And that becomes tougher and tougher. Go back to the ASHRAE question or any other code. When it begins to limit what you can do aesthetically to the point where we're all in white boxes or gray boxes, that's not so good. And yet we do need controls. There's no question about that. I wouldn't argue that in a moment. So trying to fit those counter points into the same design is growing increasingly more difficult. I think energy is going to be in the forefront of design concerns for forever. I mean, for the foreseeable future and for the unforeseeable future.
You come across in most of your comments as being quite the pragmatist in the way you describe lighting practice. In what areas would you describe yourself as a perfectionist?
You know, the older I got and the more experience I got, the more I realized how elusive perfection is. And perfection is most of the time not a worthwhile objective. If it takes you 20% of the effort to get the last 3% perfect, it doesn't make sense. And very often, very good is good enough. Perfect often is in the eye of the beholder, so it's even then it's an elusive target. I think that pragmatism in lighting design is much more desirable than the pursuit of perfection. I often used to say that I believed in designing within the art of the possible. If we came up with a design which only I could maintain because of the exotic nature of the focus and the exotic nature of the lamps, and I gave that to a client whose maintenance was performed by 55-year-old union electricians with stubby fingers, then I wasn't doing them a favor. So I often wanted to find out who's going to maintain this, literally, the person or the type of person. and then design within the art of what that type of person could maintain and have looking appropriate and work appropriately. To do something esoteric that then falls apart, you haven't done anybody a favor. So I would say that the pursuit of perfection early on seemed like a good idea, but I grew out of that pretty quickly.